and welcome to Dear Dama Store. Here, we dive into the complex world of political ideology and how it shapes the world we live in. I'm your host John, and let's get started. In this first episode, we travel into the turbulent and unknown waters of Chinese communism to uncover the ideological system of the Chinese Communist Party. This will be the start of an extraordinary journey that will lead us to the most important Marxist-Leninist ideology of our times, Xi Jinping thought, socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. In this series, I will identify and analyze the fundamental ideological elements of Xi Jinping thought, the latest ideological innovation of the Communist Party of China. Xi Jinping became the undisputed leader of China and of the Chinese Communist Party in 2013, quickly consolidating power in his own hands. Today, Xi holds all three most powerful positions in the Communist Chinese Leninist system. He is President of the People's Republic of China, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. To further consolidate his position atop Communist China's pecking order, Xi Jinping officially introduced his ideological contribution in 2017 as the latest Sinicized form of Marxism-Leninism. When Xi came to power, many assumed that his tenure would continue the economic opening of China to the outside world, initiated by Deng Xiaoping over 40 years ago, and that these policies would form an integral part of his political doctrine. However, Xi Jinping has consistently disproven such assumptions, not only with his actions, but with his ideology. Indeed, Xi Jinping thought is statist, neo-Leninist, autocratic, dictatorial, and represents a reaffirmation of a new form of Marxism-Leninism in China. Throughout this series, we will explore the main ideological elements of Xi Jinping thought, its origins, and above all, Xi's interpretation of Marxist-Leninist principles, and as how the current Chinese president practically applies them to address the challenges faced by the Chinese communists. Before delving into the specifics of Xi Jinping thought, however, we must first review the fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism and its core concepts. This is because Xi Jinping thought is not an isolated ideology. Rather, it is a product of the broader ideological system known as Chinese socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics. This system relies on a distinct methodology that continuously adapts Marxist-Leninist principles to China's evolving national conditions. In short, Marxism-Leninism provides the abstract principles that, when combined with practical Chinese reality, wield different, various adaptations. This process of constant adaptation of abstract and static Marxist principles to the changing national conditions of China is known as the Sinicization or Sinification of Marxism, essentially the process of adapting Marxist thought and principles to different stages of China's development. This is the ideological engine that has kept the party's ideological vitality alive since Mao Zedong ever instituted it. Therefore, it is impossible to fully understand Chinese socialism in general, and Xi Jinping thought in particular, without first addressing the foundational principles of Marxism-Leninism. Once these principles are clear, we will examine the mechanism of ideological innovation employed by the CCP, which shall be addressed in our second episode. This will allow us to explore the evolution of Chinese socialism from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, revealing the overarching ideological characteristics that are consistent across its various forms or adaptations. Once these characteristics are identified, we can then analyze their specific manifestation in Xi Jinping thought. So let's get started into the principles and fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. The Chinese Communist Party was established in July 1921 with the direct support of its Soviet counterparts in Moscow, whose influence had profound ideological and organizational consequences. Due to this Soviet influence, the CCP adopted the Marxist worldview and Leninist organizational principles from their Russian brethren. While much of this ideological foundation has primarily remained intact until now, it has not remained static or unchanged since 1921. Indeed, the CCP swiftly began to diverge from traditional Soviet political thought and charted its own, very distinct ideological tradition and developed its own particular form of Marxist political doctrine. Given that the CCP was founded on Marxist-Leninist principles, this shall be the starting point of the series. Thus, it is essential to address the following question. What is Marxism-Leninism? As we focus on the ideology of the CCP in general, and Xi Jinping thought in particular, we will employ the definition used by the Chinese Marxist-Leninists themselves. According to the CCP, Marxism-Leninism comprises a synthesis of the works of Marx and Engels on one hand, and the teachings of Lenin on the other. In other words, Chinese communists regard Marxism-Leninism as the fusion of the theories and abstract principles designed by Marx and Lenin, and the revolutionary praxis and organizational party principles of Vladimir Lenin, the great Russian revolutionary. Marx and Engels and their disciples adopt a materialist worldview that differentiates between the material and non-material aspects of existence. The distinction is rooted in the separation between materialism and idealism, a division that was later embraced by Mao Zedong in his renowned essay on contradiction. Perhaps this is Mao Zedong's most important work ever, and it is central to Chinese Communist Party doctrine. So what is materialism? Materialism advocates that the fundamental cause of all observable changes in the world lie in the evolution of its material aspects. In contrast, idealism ascribes the dominance and causality to non-material elements, such as ideas or consciousness. Hegelian dialectics, for example, is the most notable example of this. Dialectics is the philosophical analytical method involving a contradiction process between opposing elements, while dialectical idealists apply this method to ideas, philosophy, and other non-material forces as the driving agents of change and evolution. Materialists, such as Marx and Engels, apply the same logic to material processes and phenomena. Thus, two fundamental premises of the Marxist worldview are established. First, that the world is divided into material and non-material aspects, and second, that the material dimension is the primary driver of all observable phenomena. What then are the fundamental principles of the materialist worldview according to the Chinese Marxists? The first principle synthesizes these two elements, the dialectical method and the primacy of material aspects. This principle is called dialectical materialism and forms the foundation of the Marxist worldview. The term itself underscores its significance. Changes in non-material phenomena arise from internal dialectical processes of corresponding material conditions. The second principle of the Marxist worldview is the application of dialectical materialism to human societies, referred to as historical materialism. Thus, the two core principles of Marxism are dialectical materialism, which represents its method and worldview, and historical materialism, which applies this method to understand the evolution of human societies. All foremost communist leaders share this interpretation. Among these stand Mao Zedong, Stalin, and Xi Jinping himself. All of them regard these principles as fundamental to their ideological worldview. Having identified the core principles of Marxism-Leninism, we must now proceed to describe them in greater detail. Dialectical materialism. We will now examine the content and implications of dialectical materialism. Marx and Engels adopted a worldview that was not only a materialistic, but also dialectical, wherein all things and phenomena are interconnected and continuously undergoing transformation and evolution. All phenomena must be understood according to their own movements, relationships, interactions, and contexts. Both philosophers argue that the world is not static. It exists in a dialectical, ongoing process of formation, consolidation, and cessation, where nothing is eternal and everything is eventually superseded. Regarding practical consequences, dialectical materialism compels Marxists to master several analytical methods, particularly concerning the dialectical analysis of material contradictions. Indeed, Marxists must not only be able to understand, but also solve the contradictions they encounter, and they must engage in a dialectical analysis of the internal contradictions within material phenomena. Thus, the importance of systematic dialectical method for analyzing material conditions cannot be overstated. This is particularly significant given the role ascribed to the so-called theory of contradictions of Mao Zedong, which serves as a crucial analytical tool of the Chinese Marxist tradition. This theory is essentially a Chinese adaptation of dialectical analysis to solve the contradictions of Chinese society. Essentially, dialectical materialism, when applied to human societies, allows the Marxists to solve the problems they face through what they believe to be a scientific method. The second principle, historical materialism. As previously stated, historical materialism is the application of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of human societies. Consequentially, historical materialism posits that all non-material aspects of human society emerge from the dialectical internal development of its material elements. In other words, the non-material developments of a society, such as its political institutions, social classes, art and philosophy, are products of its economic activity and organization. As such, dialectical changes is the dominant material element, known as the economic base, drive the evolution of the non-material element, known as the superstructure. The economic base itself encompasses the entire economic system and its organization, while the superstructure includes the political system, culture, art, etc., and all the other non-material facets of society. However, this relationship is not strictly one-sided. While the superstructure can exert a limited degree of influence on the base, these instances are the exception rather than the rule. In other words, The economic and material foundation sustains the organization and social hierarchy between different classes. The economic base of any society is defined by how its economic system is structured and operates, which in Marxist terms corresponds to the concept of the mode of production. This concept consists of two key elements: the productive forces and the relations of production. The first includes all the resources available for material production in society, such as machines, technology, labor, raw materials, and other material elements. The relations of production, on the other hand, refer to the system that determines which social class holds the means of production, especially which group has power over the resources necessary for material production. Furthermore, the relations of production encompass the relationships between social classes and the power dynamics governing economic resource distribution. In other words, the relations of production reflect the asymmetries of power and resource allocation that result from the organization of economic and material life. The relations of production and the productive forces of a given historical period together constitute the mode of production, which determines how the economy is structured and how it functions. As the productive forces develop, the relations of production eventually fail to keep pace with these advancements. This results in a growing contradiction and antagonism between these two elements. Over time, the relations of production become outdated and are no longer supported by the productive forces, and begin to hinder the latter's development. This contradiction creates the conditions for the intensification of class struggle. Class struggle refers to the dialectical conflict between the various social classes within a given mode of production. As this struggle intensifies, it leads to social revolution. At a certain point, the further development of the productive forces comes into conflict with the existing relations of production. When this reaches a critical juncture, the conditions for transforming the prevailing mode of production arise. By understanding and mastering these vast and impersonal material forces, Marxists claim the ability to predict the evolution of human societies. However, it is essential to note that none of these elements are fixed or static. The economic base and the superstructure are in fact in a perpetual state of flux. They emerge, evolve, and eventually dissolve in an ongoing process. The stages of development in this process are not neatly compartmentalized either, and one mode of production is not instantaneously replaced by another. Rather, remnants of the previous mode of production coexist alongside the nascent elements of the future mode of production. Hence, a particular mode of production is succeeded by another, which finds its origins in the preceding one. For example, Marx and Engels themselves, in their great work The Communist Manifesto, described this very process. In their analysis of the transition from the feudalist mode of production to the capitalist one, they observe that the seeds of capitalism itself emerged while the feudal mode of production was still in force. This is what is called the engine of history that enables Marxist-Leninists to comprehend the evolution of human societies. Another fundamental premise of this historical materialism is that transitions between modes of production are contingent upon the material conditions necessary to facilitate such change. Before a society can move to a new mode of production, it must first attain a certain level of development in its productive forces and the corresponding relations of production. In other words, the transition to a new mode of production depends upon the material foundations created by the preceding one, meaning that it would be impossible to, for example, jump from a feudal mode of production to a communist mode of production. For instance, when the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917 through armed revolution, and after the Civil War, when they defeated Kolchak, they attempted to establish a communist society outright. However, as Lenin later acknowledged after the Civil War, this endeavor ultimately failed catastrophically due to the absence of the material prerequisites for such a transition. This was particularly true in the underdevelopment of Russian productive forces, since Russia was still reliant on a quasi-feudal mode of production. Now, let's jump to one of the most important points in Marxist-Leninist thought: the capitalist mode of production. The first defining feature of the capitalist mode of production is its social structure, which comprises a ruling class and a subjugated one, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat respectively. The second feature is the ownership of the means of production by the bourgeoisie, in the form of private property, which separates the proletariat from direct control over the means of production. Third, because the proletarians do not own the means of production, they are compelled to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie to meet their basic needs. Finally, the capitalist mode of production is driven by the accumulation of wealth, which is either collected as profit by the bourgeoisie or reinvested by it to enhance the means of production, thereby increasing productivity and maximizing profits. Thus, the capitalist mode of production is characterized by the relations of production between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and by a set of productive forces that are constantly evolving. Following the logic of historical materialism, Marx and Engels conclude in the Communist Manifesto that the capitalist mode of production is destined to collapse under the weight of its internal contradictions. As said in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The weapons with which the bourgeoisie overthrew feudalism are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself." End quote. Marx and Engels argue that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without continuously revolutionizing the means of production. In other words, the process that overthrew the previous modes of production will ultimately destroy capitalism. Central to Marxist analysis is the relationship between the productive forces and relations of production. As the productive forces advance, the living conditions of the proletariat deteriorate proportionately. The proletariat, oppressed and exploited by the bourgeoisie, must meet its basic needs for exploitation in order for exploitation to be sustainable. However, because capitalists are in constant competition, they are compelled to invest more and more capital into the means of production. This dynamic results in the bourgeoisie's increasing inability to meet the basic needs of the proletariat or to maintain control over the economic and social system they dominate. Consequentially, the dialectical relationship between the means of production and the relations of production becomes increasingly contradictory, with the latter becoming less and less capable of keeping pace with the former. The internal contradictions of the capitalist mode of production combined with the growing impoverishment of the proletariat and the widening inequality between them and the bourgeoisie, create the conditions for social revolution through class struggle. The intensifying conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will result in the overthrow of the former by the latter, paving the way for the end of capitalism and the establishment of the famous dictatorship of the proletariat. This process of dialectical evolution between the forces and relations of production is not unique to capitalism. Rather, it is universal, and it has led to the downfall of all previous modes of production. According to Marx and Engels, however, there would be a unique feature in this new proletarian revolution. That is, it would be the first instance in history in which an oppressed class overthrew its oppressors. But why? Well, because in all previous transitions, class struggle occurred only between oppressor classes, as exemplified by the transition from feudalism to capitalism. In that case, the old oppressor class, the feudal landowners or landlords of the medieval period, or nobles, were largely and gradually replaced by a new one, the capitalist bourgeoisie. In contrast, however, Marx envisioned that the proletarian revolution would see the oppressed class, the proletariat, overthrow their oppressors, the bourgeoisie, leading to the triumph of the workers and the masses. Once the conditions for a proletarian revolution are met, the transition from capitalism to the communist mode of production begins. However, this transition, like the revolution itself, does not occur instantaneously. It unfolds gradually and in stages. The proletarian revolution does not happen simultaneously on a global scale either, as some nations lack the material conditions and prerequisites necessary for such a transition. For instance, Marx and Engels mention several European peoples in many of their articles, such as the Basques and certain Slavic groups, such as the Serbs and the Croats, as being too historically underdeveloped to reach the point of proletarian revolution, in essence because these people were still in a somewhat medieval mode of production. It was impossible to bring them up to the point of being revolutionary. However, as Marx and Engels note, even these more backward nations would eventually be compelled to adopt the capitalist mode of production under the threat of extinction. This then suggests that the proletarian revolution would first occur in industrialized capitalist countries. Another key factor is class consciousness, which refers to the proletariat's awareness that its members share common interests as a class, irrespective of nationality. This international class consciousness does not develop instantaneously either, but gradually expands to a global dimension. Initially, class consciousness forms through trade unions and assumes a national character, with the proletariat of each nation confronting its own respective national bourgeoisie. Eventually, the proletariat will recognize its shared interests and become aware of its class consciousness at a global level, adopting an international character that ignores any and all national barriers. This global awareness of a united worldwide proletarian class is famously encapsulated by Marx and Engels in the rallying cry of the Communist Manifesto, quote, workers of the world, unite, end quote. Now we address the stages of development in socialism and the transitional stage of socialism. The division of the historical evolution of human societies into stages of material development is an essential characteristic of Marxism. A stage of development is a particular moment corresponding to a period of human history during which a specific mode of production, base and superstructure prevail. However, this division does not end with historical progress composed of four modes of production: slavery first, then feudalism, then capitalism, and eventually communism. Each of these stages of development is subdivided into particular phases. For example, Lenin clarified that the most acute and intense phase of capitalism was the imperialist phase, in which a handful of affluent countries dominate the world and extract the resources of other less developed nations. Like the other stages of development, capitalism is not a monolithic stage during which its characteristics remain static and fixed. At this point, it is worth remembering the lessons of dialectical and historical materialism. That is, all phenomena and developmental processes are in constant movement and change, and in a continuous process of formation, evolution, and cessation. This phased and gradual development also applies to all stages of development. However, these are not only phased. Marx and Engels also stated that localized and embryonic forms of capitalism existed in the stage of feudalism, meaning that each mode of production can contain elements or remnants of previous and future modes of production. This subdivision and gradual evolution are essential to understand the transitional stage of development known as socialism, which constitutes the intermediate phase between capitalism and communism, during which the dictatorship of the proletariat prevails. The phase of socialism, the socialist phase, is considered the first stage of communism. That is, it is the transitional stage before reaching full, complete communism. In turn, full communism is the final phase of the stage of development of that same name, in which private property and class divisions disappear and the state is eventually abolished. The moment when the proletariat seizes political power represents the beginning of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of the socialist stage of development, that involves the monopolization of state power in the hands of the proletariat, the collectivization of the economy, the end of private property, and the abolition of class distinctions. Although Marx and Engels elaborated on the general characteristics of socialism, they were never able to proceed to a concrete and detailed systematization of it. Their main concern was to form a movement capable of overthrowing capitalism, and not to elaborate detailed theories about a socialist future. This task fell to socialist revolutionaries such as Lenin, who led the October Revolution of 1917 in Russia, dethroning the Tsar, dethroning the provisionary government, and installing the Bolshevik dictatorship. This same revolutionary experience launched Lenin in an attempt to build a socialist system. However, the Russian productive forces had a level of development far below what was necessary. The economy was primarily rural, and its proletariat was small. Also, Russia was devastated by the brutal civil war between the White Army led by General Kolchak and Denikin and the Bolsheviks themselves. Additionally, Russia did not meet the material conditions required to transition to the stage of communism. Another case mentioned by Lenin is China, whose stage of feudal development prevented any possibility of the country moving directly to socialism without first going through a preparatory phase of capitalism. The dilemma of conducting a Marxist revolution in a rural country was particularly important in the Chinese case, constituting one of the focuses of Mao Zedong's thought. Like the other stages of development, socialism is not static or singular, but comprises a series of interconnected, more miniaturized stages that follow one another. The construction of a stable dictatorship of the proletariat and the creation of the material prerequisites necessary to effect the transition from socialism to full communism are lengthy and complex processes. Lenin's observation that Russia did not have the necessary material basis for the direct transition to full communism is a direct consequence of this vision of a gradual, material, and dialectical evolution of history. This is the Marxist worldview, marked by the evolution of the material and economic elements of human society, and by the vast impersonal forces that govern the history of humanity. The entire ideological tradition of the Chinese Communist Party rests on this very own material and dialectical theoretical basis, and is the source of all ideological contributions from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. Having examined the Marxist element of Marxism-Leninism, we will now examine the Leninist element, specifically the two essential principles of party organization developed by the Russian revolutionary leader Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is particularly significant in this analysis for two reasons. First, his model of party organization was adopted by the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and continues to be implemented today in the form of democratic centralism. Second, the role of the party as a revolutionary vanguard has been crucial in the ideological evolution and history of the Chinese communists. Marx and Engels argued that the communists have a particular role in the revolutionary process, especially in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. In essence, they must raise the proletariat's awareness of its shared interests on an international scale and lead the efforts of this oppressed class. One of Lenin's most notable contributions to this aspect was his concept of vanguardism, which he developed based on the role that Marx and Engels assigned to the communists themselves. Lenin contended that for the proletariat revolution and the construction of a socialist state to succeed, the entire process must be led by a revolutionary and intellectual vanguard in the form of a communist party. Although Lenin does not offer a concise definition of the vanguard, his essay comprehensively analyzes the concept. In his famous essay, What is to be Done?, Lenin critiques other Russian revolutionaries, accusing them of rejecting the vanguard concept and adopting a trade unionist political conception of politics. Trade unionism focused on organizing workers, but lacked the leadership of a professional revolutionary vanguard. Lenin considered such efforts spontaneous and lacking capable and decisive leadership, and ultimately destined to either fail or fall into the hands of the bourgeoisie. In other words, it is insufficient for workers to organize spontaneously. They need a professional class of revolutionaries and Leninist intellectuals to guide them in order to succeed. Without such leadership and a proper understanding of the vast impersonal and material laws that govern human history, a proletarian revolution is eventually bound to fail or to be co-opted by the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the Communist Party, as the proletariat's vanguard, must lead the struggle to establish a socialist system. This conception was encapsulated by Lenin in his famous essay What is to be Done, in one of his most famous quotes, quoting, "We must take upon ourselves the task of organizing an all-round political struggle under the leadership of our party in such a manner as to make it possible for all oppositional strata to render their fullest support to the struggle and to our party. We must train our social democratic practical workers to become political leaders, able to guide all the manifestations of this all-round struggle." End quote. However, the necessity of the vanguard does not arise solely from the weaknesses of alternatives like trade unionism, which Lenin viewed as vulnerable to bourgeois manipulation. The fundamental issue lies in the correct interpretation of the material laws of history, which the vanguard understands perfectly, but the proletariat as a whole does not. Without a political vanguard of professional revolutionaries, not only would any workers' movement eventually fail and be co-opted by the bourgeoisie, it would have the wrong interpretation of the material laws established by Marx and Engels. This notion of the vanguard party is also a primary reason for why Lenin developed the principle of democratic centralism. But what is democratic centralism? Well, democratic centralism is an organizational method that concentrates power in the hands of the Communist Party and of the revolutionary elite which comprises it, ensuring unified and decisive leadership in the struggle for socialism. One of the defining characteristics of Leninism is precisely this one: democratic centralism. In the text Freedom to Criticize and Unity of Action, Lenin clearly outlined the essence of democratic centralism. The democratic aspect involves a decision process within party structures. Members gather to discuss, debate, and ultimately decide on which policies should be adopted through collective decision-making. The centralist aspect takes effect once a decision has been reached. When the Politburo or another party organ decides by majority voting, that decision becomes binding and must be adhered to by the entire party without exception. This method was formalized at the 6th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1917, with 4 fundamental principles. 1. All party organs are elected internally. 2nd, party organs must regularly report their activities to their respective party organizations. 3rd, strict party discipline is enforced, requiring the total subordination of the minority to the majority once a decision is taken. 4th, all decisions that the highest party organs make are binding, and all lower party organs must fully implement and accept them. Democratic centralism is the organizational form of Marxist-Leninist parties, such as the Chinese Communist Party. While it is termed democratic, This classification is vastly different from the concept of democracy found in liberal democratic states, such as in Western Europe, the United States, Japan, and so on. Liberal democracies, like these ones, are characterized by universal suffrage and principles like the separation of powers. In contrast, Marxist-Leninist democratic centralism rejects the notion of universal suffrage as incompatible with the leadership of those who fully comprehend the material laws of history. According to Marxism-Leninism, the masses do not possess the knowledge necessary to lead the revolution or effectively implement the proletariat's dictatorships. This is the reason, one of the reasons, why every single Marxist state has rejected universal suffrage. For if the proletariat voted, they would have run the risk of wrong interpretation of Marxist principles. As a result, Leninism posits that the only way to conduct a successful socialist revolution and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat is through the absolute authority of the vanguard party and of the organizational framework of democratic centralism. The party, guided by those who understand historical materialism and dialectical materialism, must direct the proletariat and the broader masses, ensuring that the revolutionary objectives are met through a unified, disciplined approach. So, we have concluded the first episode, the fundamental theoretical basis of Marxism-Leninism. These are the essential elements of Marxism-Leninist ideology, from the theoretical foundation and starting point for analyzing the Chinese Communist Party's ideological system. This theoretical grounding facilitates a comprehensive and in-depth analysis of the CCP's key ideological components. By examining original Marxist and Leninist sources, we can understand the ideological worldview of the CCP and its leaders. As we progress, it will become apparent that the leadership of the CCP continues to uphold this materialistic and dialectical worldview. The universal concepts of Marx and Engels, namely dialectical and historical materialism, combined with the Leninist organizational principles and revolutionary methodologies, form the core of the CCP's ideological, tradition and organizational framework. This separation also aligns with the work of one of the greatest sinologists of the 20th century, the great German professor Franz Schurman, who is a preeminent scholar of CCP ideology and party organization. As Schurman notes in his magnum opus, Ideology and Organization in Communist China, while Marxism provides a broad theoretical foundation, Leninism provides organizational and structural principles. This distinction is crucial to understand the CCP's ideological evolution. Having established the Marxist-Leninist character of the CCP's worldview, we can now examine how Chinese Marxists interpret and adapt these principles, beginning with the founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong. Mao's thought represents a critical phase in the development of Chinese Marxism, reflecting both continuity with Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy and innovations tailored to the unique condition of China. By grounding itself in the universal aspects of Marxism and Leninism, the CCP's ideological system is shown to be deeply rooted in both the materialist understanding of history and the revolutionary strategies of Leninism. As we move forward, The focus will shift to how these fundamental principles are adapted, interpreted, and applied by Mao and all subsequent CCP leaders in shaping the distinctive path of Chinese socialism. Well, and there you have it. This is my first episode. From now on, in the second one, we will focus on Mao's role in the creation of Chinese socialism itself. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe in the button below. This is your host John signing off. Adamastor out.